Yeah, and to you, pal, as well. My dad's bigger than yours anyway. Yeah. God damn. Oh, this bloody hurts. Oh, man. I've deserved a lot of things in life, but I don't think I deserve that one. Bloody CD 32 owners. Oh, ow, 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 oh. Must have been something I said. Anyway, where was I? Okay, hey there folks, how you all doing? I hope you're doing well. So thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of 12 Days of Amiga, ranking worst to best. So today is number 8, and yeah, I've had some interesting comments so far on all of the videos. Some people agreeing with my ranking, some people disagreeing, some people disagreeing very strongly, but that's all good. I think if we was all the same, it would be a very boring world. But yeah, thank you for all your feedback so far. If you like the kind of stuff I do encourage you to have a little look at that video description, because there are ways that you can actually help support the channel. It's something I've been doing for nearly 5 years now, and I just hope that you can continue to enjoy it. Anyway, today's video is all about number 8. Now, I think some people would have been expecting today's machine to be maybe in one of the previous videos, but if you know me, I'm reasonably fond of the machine that I'm about to unveil today. So without further ado, let's get straight on in with it. So, in at number 8 today, Pop Pickers, is the Amiga 600. Yeah. So hopefully this puts to bed some of the comments about my bias as such, because I hope in this video that I can demonstrate that whilst I have a great deal of affection for the Amiga 600 myself, I still regard that there were many things about this machine that were hopelessly wrong at the time that it was launched, and for the problems that it caused Commodore and the Amiga brand as a whole at that time. So, what is the Amiga 600? Well, it's this. It's the Amiga Mini that was launched last year. Oh, of course it wasn't. You know that. That was a little plastic toy with an emulator in it. This is actually a real Amiga though, arguably. So yes, it's basically a very compact Amiga system. Apologies if you can hear the washing machine in the background. I don't have a recording studio.
That is fantastic. Thanks a lot. Thanks very much. What? I'd offer you a cup of tea, but the kettle's broken as well.
What, this kettle?
Yeah, it cuts out just before it gets to boiling point.
Do you want me to have a word?
The Amiga 600 was launched in April of 1992 or thereabouts, and was the formal successor to the Amiga 500 line, and it didn't do very well, and it wasn't very well liked at the time either. So I want to step you through some of the background to this machine and how it came to market, including some stuff which I've uncovered which pretty much nobody seems to talk about, so hopefully that'll be mildly interesting. And then take you through the repercussions of this machine's launch, as well as what I think about it in this day and age in 2022 and beyond, and perhaps that will explain to some extent why I place this machine just only slightly above the CD32 and the other machines that we've seen so far. So, let's get straight on into that history aspect. The Amiga 500 finally gained some traction by about 1988, 1989, particularly in the European market, as a system that people were migrating to, either from 8-bit micros or potentially even some ST owners were like, no, the Amiga really is a better computer. And price drops also helped enable this happen, along with, in the main, fairly compelling software packages or bundles from Commodore. So, as early as 1990-91, Commodore was thinking about how can we make the Amiga cheaper still. The Amiga 500 was launched in 1987 as a cost-reduced Amiga 1000 design. That was the very first Amiga, and in that they also repackaged it into like an all-in-one wedge-style unit like the Amiga 600 here. So the computer is also part of the keyboard, inverted commas. So, how do you cost reduce an Amiga 500? Well, one of the things that they were looking to do was to move the low-cost Amiga to surface mount technology. Now, for most of us, it's a fairly boring thing, but it essentially means that the components are directly soldered to the main board, the motherboard of the system, rather than being in sockets. So on an Amiga 500, you can pop in and out many of the components because they're in these little sockets. But with this design, everything would be directly attached to the main board. But beyond that, I start running out of ideas of how you can genuinely cost reduce an Amiga 500. Yes, physical size is one of those things, but in the bill of materials it isn't going to be that expensive. And it's not like you can downgrade the Amiga chipset in some way, because otherwise it's just going to stop functioning, and you don't really need to make the Amiga worse. If anything, you want to enhance it to make it relevant in the marketplace by the time that this particular machine is launched. And likewise, you can't decide, well, we'll just do away with Paula because we don't really need her. Because you need that particular chip for example, the serial ports, the floppy disk drive control, and almost most famously what Paula does is the audio side of the Amiga. So you can't just take components out, and neither do you want to slow it down either, because it's just not going to function. So from the very off, regardless of all the other things that happened in this machine's creation, I'm a little bit confused about how Commodore was really seriously proposing to drastically cost reduce the Amiga. I mean, if they did firm up on a cartridge-based design, as I posited in the Amiga 500 Plus video a couple of videos back, then yes, you would save the money on a floppy drive, but, you know, really, is that going to knock $100, £100 or whatever off the actual list price of this machine? I'm a little bit sceptical of that. So I feel that whilst what I'm about to talk about is largely to blame for the Amiga 600's dismal performance in the marketplace at the time and dismal reputation at the time, I feel that in the off this project is a bit wrong-headed. But anyway, so the Amiga 600 started out as a low-end Amiga, as I say, and was tentatively given the code name of Amiga 300 to distinguish it as being a step down from the 500 model. And I don't think that's particularly news to most people these days. Even some of the earliest Amiga 600s that were released and purchasable by the public had Amiga 300s silkscreened onto the motherboard, so no real news there. But the main designer behind the Amiga 600 at the time was a chap called George Robbins. Now, he was a fantastic engineer at Commodore, sadly passed away, but he was responsible for much of the design of the Amiga 500, the 500 Plus in turn as well, and also the 1200 and CD32. And I believe he may have had some involvement with the A590 external hard disk for the 500 series as well, but I may be wrong about that. But he was a driving force behind the cost-reduced Amiga project. And he came up with various fascinating ways to shrink the size down, and even invented a very low-cost built-in gen-locking device to this low-cost machine, which sadly this lacks. But the idea of a gen-lock is that you can retime the Amiga to external video components, so like a camcorder for example, or a VCR. The Amiga would run off the timing of those devices, and then you could overlay Amiga graphics, animations, titles, text, all sorts on top of live video, and then potentially put it back out to another VCR or something similar to that, allowing you to basically do like home video editing in a way. Quite a neat capability that the Amiga had, and maybe quite a compelling reason to market a little dinky Amiga, which could be sort of an upmarket video titler. But sadly, that was all dropped. Coincidental to this was the change of management in Commodore. The former head of engineering, Dr. Henry Rubin, was replaced by a chap by the name of Bill Sidneys, or Sidneys. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his name, but apologies if I get it wrong. And he had been working in the PC engineering side of Commodore for a little while, and was brought over by Mediali to head up the Amiga side. And his reputation was that he didn't know that much about PCs or IBM PC compatibles, let alone Amigas. Now, I am slightly sceptical of that, if I'm honest, because he was not only famously one of the driving forces behind the IBM PC Junior project, which was a failure, but also he was part of the original IBM PC team. the original 5150, I think it is. And so maybe his contributions to that were minimal, I don't know. But I sometimes wonder whether this definition of him being completely clueless about PCs as well is entirely deserved. Maybe it is, but anyway, by the by. He came in from a PC background and obviously started cancelling various Amiga projects left, right and centre to save money, because if we know anything about management, they like to polish their laurels, justify their existence, and one of the ways that they can make themselves look good to upper management is to be able to go into fucking boring board meetings and go to their higher-ups and say, hey, I've cost reduced or cut costs in my department by X%, you know, maybe I deserve a bonus kind of thing. Anyway, that's management for you. Well, most management that I've experienced anyway. So that is essentially what he set out doing, and this meant that various projects around Commodore were vastly scaled back and slowed down. Things like the AAA Advanced Amiga architecture, which was formally started in 1988, that slowed down to a complete crawl. Other projects like Pandora or AGA were basically put on the back burner. Other projects that were really coming to fruition, such as the Amiga 3000 Plus, which I'll talk about in its own time, the Amiga 1000 Plus, which I talked a little bit about in the Amiga 1500 video. These were AGA or Pandora based Amigas that would allow 256 colour screens, and basically what ended up in the 1200 and 4000, but a year or two prior to those machines appearing on the marketplace, and may have done actually quite a bit of good work for the Amiga essentially. But that was all canned and replaced with reinventing the wheel with various enhanced chipset Amiga systems, and that was the chipset that was first seen in the Amiga 3000 in 1990. So an ECS was at very, very best a very mild upgrade to the original chipset that was launched in the Amiga in 1985. So really we're not seeing any significant product innovation. It's just repackaging what Commodore had been selling for a number of years by this stage, maybe rationalising the design so that things were on motherboards or slightly cheaper processor cards and so forth, but fundamentally the same stuff that the marketplace already had, and therefore, you know, continuing to lose its edge against the PC and the Macintosh of the time. And obviously this also affected the Amiga 300 project, because some of the things that perhaps were said about the Amiga 500 is that you had to have an external hard disk. You couldn't necessarily easily install one internally. It required custom modifications. Or when it came to expanding memory, again, a similar kind of thing, external components or having to plug something into that 68,000 slot. So what do? Well, what happened is that they integrated an IDE controller, an extremely cheap IDE controller, but one nonetheless, onto the motherboard of this cost-reduced Amiga, allowing for 2.5-inch laptop hard disk drives to be installed directly inside the machine. And on top of that, the nascent cartridge port, which was rumoured to be part of this low-cost Amiga project, was transformed into a PCM-CIA slot. Now, PCM-CIA was a very new emerging standard at the time for laptop IBM PC compatibles in the main, but it would also appear on other systems such as the Amiga and the Macintosh, and would allow expansions that were otherwise virtually impossible to add to your laptop computer in any meaningful way at the time. So things like network cards, RAM expansions, solid state memory, modems, SCSI controllers, CD-ROM controllers, potentially custom scanner interfaces, all this kind of stuff. So it was a way of giving your laptop computer a bit of extra functionality that, you know, like your laptop or luggerboard that had preceded it didn't necessarily have. So on paper that sounds like a really fantastic thing to add to an Amiga, but the problem is that this was, like, in a way, kind of cutting edge technology at the time. You know, it was really new stuff, and therefore it was very expensive. And so where the Amiga 500 had all this range of various third-party and also first-party expansions from Commodore that fitted onto the 86-pin edge connector on the side of that machine, the Amiga 600 just wouldn't have those. So you've got that, capable but extremely expensive. And then to put the real nail in the coffin, the actual guts of this machine are nothing more than an Amiga 500 Plus. 1 megabyte of chip RAM, yay, okay, nice. A 68,000 running at the same speed as the first Amiga launched in 1985, 7 point something megahertz, and the mildly rehashed ECS chipset. Beyond that, what you're looking at is an Amiga 500 Plus in a very dinky form factor. And how does it get that dinky form factor? It lops off the numeric keypad. Now, I'm of the opinion that for my uses, that never really hampered me that much, because I don't really and didn't really play the games that used numeric keypads, flight sims, simulations, that kind of stuff. And where I used applications that did have numeric keypad shortcuts and so forth, such as Dulux Paint with its perspective tools, you could remap through either a little commodity or in later versions of dpaint it supported directly to other key combinations. So for me, it didn't really cause much of an impact, but it did cause consternation in the marketplace. So I want to take you through some of the things that, you know, people don't often talk about with the Amiga 600 project, and I'm well aware that I'm probably already 15 minutes into this video, so I'm going to try and go through these things quite quickly. So by late 1991, the Amiga 600, or Amiga 300 as it was still being called, was finished. And this is where I want to just talk very briefly about the way that Commodore as a company worked. You had Commodore US, which dealt mostly with the engineering side. Some was also carried out in Germany, but largely many of the innovations, shall we say, would be derived at this time by the US engineering department. And the way that Commodore worked is that it would have various subsidiaries around the world that were essentially independent companies, such as Commodore UK, Commodore Benelux, Commodore Germany, and so forth. And what would happen is that each of these companies would have separate sales and marketing teams, so they weren't coordinated. But what this did mean is that because Commodore by this time was in many respects a engineering-led product development company, there was very little overall management strategy on this front, the CDTV being one rare exception to this, where it did get endorsement from Irving Gould. What would happen is that engineering would come up with products and then try to sell them, in essence, to the various divisions of Commodore around the world, or not so much divisions, but companies. And so, famously, projects or products like the Amiga 2200 and 2400, which I will talk about in another video, were completed products, but no Commodore company around the world ever bought them because they said, nobody's going to buy that. That doesn't do anything for the marketplace. But what happened to the Amiga 600 or 300 as it was at the time was a little bit different, because the minute that this was finished up, the Amiga 500 was cancelled. That was it. It was done. There was no like, oh, the Amiga 500 will carry on for a little bit and then will quietly discontinued. It was cancelled. And so it meant that to replace the Amiga 500, the various companies around the world of Commodore had no choice but essentially to buy this machine. By which time it had morphed into a product that was more expensive than the Amiga 500 that it had replaced. So as a low-cost option, it had completely failed. And it is clear that at various different Commodore companies, management at the very top was saying, hey, no, this is a great machine, we really do need to buy this. But it was quite clear from other parts of those Commodore companies that there were strong doubts about this machine and capabilities. And various memos from Bill Sidney's and so forth were sent around to the company saying, no, the 600 will, the 300 will be able to do this, that and the other. You'll be able to get these kinds of expansions. And it even laid bare that Commodore was proposing to create first-party add-ons for the 600 in PCM CIA form. But as we all know, none of these came to bear. I don't think they were anything more than basically somebody citing them on a memo. I don't think there was any serious product development going on that front. But it also shows up that as early as mid-1992, as you'd well expect, the Amiga 1200 was well underway by this point as well, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But yeah, it's quite clear that there was a lot of discontent around Commodore about this machine. And so, you know, various messages were tried to be conveyed to the upper echelons to Commodore to say, look, no, this is madness. We can't go out and start selling this machine. But unfortunately, those that had the ear of, Mediali and so forth, such as Petro Tichenko, it appears that the message was never relayed to them, because they were like, no, this is what the market wants. It's all going to be great. It'll all be gravy, just you see. Sounds a bit like that statement from Requiem from a Dream, does it? Or For a Dream, doesn't it? So it'll be fine, just you see, or something like that. Anyway, great movie, great book as well. Bit of a harrowing read, as any Hubert Selby Jr. novels are, but anyway, I digress. Anyway, so yeah, they had no choice but to launch this machine to the public, and of course, obviously, it came in at exactly the same price point as the Amiga 500 Plus that it replaced. And I think it's fair to say that it didn't get an easy ride, and largely bombed in the marketplace, because coincidental to this, the Super Nintendo was launched in Europe, the Amiga's strongest market, and as the Mega Drive was getting a really firm foothold by this stage as well, the Amiga's presence in the marketplace just began to go down and down and down. And this was shown basically by 1993 with the stonking loss that Commodore made of that year, as their turnover just basically crashed through the floor and then some. The Amiga 600 did something for Commodore, but it didn't do it alone. All of the things that led up to this machine's stagnant, functionality and so forth also did for it, because no matter how you packaged up an ECS Amiga in 1992, 68020, 68030, I don't care, RAM, whatever, it wasn't going to be putting out what people were looking for on their Mega Drives and so forth. For me, 92 was the year that we could play Super Mario Kart. We had famously Sonic Tuesday in late 92. Those are the games that people were migrating to and expecting for their systems, and gradually the Amiga was just getting left behind as the next couple of years unfolded, and that's why ultimately the Amiga's presence in the marketplace just, fizzled out, sadly. But, so yeah, the Amiga 600, there it is. A bit of a bomb at the time. So, that begs the question, almost 25 minutes or thereabouts into this video, of why this machine has restored its reputation, both with myself and I feel deserves a little bit higher than the CD32. And these are my reasons. So yes, it's true that I have a lot of affection for the Amiga 600 because this was my first machine. I put a little bit of the inheritance that I received from my granddad's passing of 93 towards this machine, and as an upgrade to the C64, I thought it was fantastic. I love playing Lemmings on it. I love messing around with Dulux Paint, and you could say that very little has changed over the years. So from a personal standpoint, I have a lot of affection for this machine, but that really only came to its own because of the things that were put into this machine that arguably made it a bit of an expensive bomb at the time of launch, that have now put it in good stead. Because as good as the CD32 might be now for playing Amiga games on, it's a relatively compact solution for doing so. You can expand them to put like an SD card in, faster processor, more RAM to make it even more convenient to run games from. They are expensive. And the Amiga 600, out of all the Amigas, pretty much remains one of the most affordable options out there, because you can easily put a compact flash card or SD card inside of this machine, so it's nice and neat, onto that IDE header, and store a vast array of the Amiga's games library. Certainly, I would say most of the Amiga's worthwhile games library, and that makes it nice and compact. On top of that, you can easily put 1 megabyte of chip RAM into these machines. Very easy, just put it in the bottom, it's very cheap. Another bonus is that there was no real-time clock baked onto the motherboard of these machines like the Amiga 500 Plus, so you don't have to worry about that problem of battery acid potentially making it uneconomical to repair. So that's a real benefit. You tend to find that real-time clocks were like the Amiga 500 expansions on that chip RAM expansion card. As for PCM-CIA, well, yeah, pretty much what Bill Sidney's put in his memo you could do with that expansion, but it required third parties. So yes, you can get compatible Ethernet controllers for it, you can get compatible modems, I believe, for it, but I might be wrong on that front. You can get RAM expansions for it. They are slow, but they work, and they can be expensive now, but I have a little 2 megabyte PCM-CIA RAM card, which acts as fast RAM. It also speeds up the machine by a third or so, which, not to be overlooked. It doesn't make a massive difference, to be honest with you, but hey, it does it. So you can easily add RAM to these machines. But even more importantly is the fact that you can get a really cheap compact flash card adapter. And what this allows is for easy transfer of information from your PC, your Macintosh, your Linux box to and from this machine. You basically just put the card in, and with the right driver you can basically access a FAT formatted compact flash card. And this is where it plays into where I feel that this machine begins to redeem itself a little bit in this day and age, because I think that this is a fantastic little Amiga if you want to do pixel art, animation, or Pro Tracker, or Octamed, or any of those creative things that are very much making use of the Amiga's, in this day and age, quirky but deeply interesting custom chipset. Because whilst AGA might offer you 256 colour screens, I enjoy working within the limitations of OCS, ECS. I feel that that's what I like. And the sound hardware of the 1200 and 4000 CD32 for that matter, excluding CDs that is the same on this machine. So in a way, because you can just plug in one audio cable into the left audio channel on this machine, it will actually output all 4 channels of the Amiga's audio through that without that wide stereo separation that Amigas before this have. And you can kind of use this like a 4-track recorder. You know, isn't that really cool that you can do that? And you could perhaps, you know, create one set of 4 tracks and then record those into your, I don't know, Audacity or whatever, save that as a WAV file, then create your next 4 tracks, record those and bring them together. So I feel that offers some very exciting potential for musicians. Also, like I say, I enjoy messing around with D-Paint on my Amiga 600, or at least I did before I came to Japan. So I like working within those limitations. With 2MB of chip RAM, you can actually do quite extensive animations on this system, and of course with that mass storage built in, it makes for a very convenient way to store your work and so forth, and it's easy to take it back off of the Amiga, put it onto an external compact flash card and put it into your modern day system and then manipulate it further. So a nice system. A couple of things to be aware of though on these machines. First of all, as I mentioned at the very start, the components of this machine are soldered directly onto the motherboard. So that includes the processor, the 68000. And whilst expansions exist to speed up these machines quite phenomenally, they can be a bit finicky in some systems. Your mileage may vary. Sometimes the boards get a little bit unstable and can cause the machine to freeze or crash, although I believe modern expansions are a lot better than they used to be back in the day. I'm looking at you, Apollo 630. Ugh. And also, the other thing to be aware of is that the very earliest Amiga 600s come with a Kickstart ROM 37.299. It's still labelled as Kickstart 205, but it's got a slightly different revision number. And this is just Commodore at its absolute best. It doesn't support the IDE or PCMCIA slot. So really all you've got is an Amiga 500 Plus, but without the keypad and the real-time battery clocked. Absolutely phenomenal. So at very minimum you want to be looking for an Amiga 600 with 37.300 on, but of course the easiest way to solve this is just to buy a new pair of, or no, it's not a pair of Kickstart ROMs, a new Kickstart ROM for your 600, which you can easily buy these days, 3.1 or 3.2, whatever they're up to these days, I forget now. So but yeah, basically that's where I feel that this machine redeems itself. And yes, it's true, it lacks the numeric keypad, so some games will have incompatibilities if they use them. If you use WHD load, which is the mechanism which allows you to put Amiga floppy games onto your hard disk or your compact flash card or SD card inside of this machine, they'll remap the numeric keypad to potentially other key presses on the keyboard, but that's on a per game basis. So if there is a particular flight sim or simulator that you really like that uses numeric keypad, do check it out beforehand. And secondly, obviously, as this doesn't have the AGA, there are obviously some games that you're not going to be able to play on this. You know, worthwhile Amiga AGA games that come to mind are like Simon and the Sorcerer, Banshee, I'm sure there are others, Subwar 2050 for example. There are others out there, but the vast majority of the Amiga library is compatible with this machine, And where there were AGA games like Bubble and Squeak, for example, there were ECS versions as well. Viracop also comes to mind, very colourful in an AGA Amiga, but also available for ECS Amigas. So all is not lost with this machine, because you'll probably be able to play around about 95% of the Amiga games library. Of course, obviously, if you don't have an accelerator, things like Doom and Gloom and other sort of 3D games might be a bit sluggish on a 68,000 Amiga 600, but you do have that option there to buy a processor upgrade. But I feel that these machines still come in relatively cheap for real hardware, and if real hardware is what you're looking for, I feel that Amiga-wise, in 2022, this offers the biggest bang for the buck. The stuff that I see people do with their 600s, like Hoffman with his amazing DJing and so forth, using a pair of Amiga 600s, is absolutely phenomenal. And of course, he does a lot of the things that I talk about in terms of bringing samples from better recording equipment and so forth, putting them into ProTracker and Optimed and all this kind of stuff, as do other music producers, and producing just wonderful, wonderful creations that embrace the limitations of the original and ECS Amiga chipsets. And I feel that this is a beautiful little machine to do it on. But, that all said, it does also have a lot of things that weren't right about it at the time that ultimately probably did a real number on Commodore. But I don't think the Amiga 600 was entirely to blame for them. I feel that the rot had set in before the Amiga 600 was released on the market, but it just compounded all of the issues that Commodore was inflicting on itself. So yeah, great little machine in 2022. Terrible machine at launch, and for that reason it sits not quite in the middle of my ranking, but in the lower echelons of this ranking list, and I feel that's as fair as I can be to a machine that I have a great deal of love for. So hopefully it shows that whilst I am probably a little bit biased, I am trying to be fair in my judgments. Anyway, I think that's all I can say about this one. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about my comments on this machine. Throw them down in the comments. Do you agree with me? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think this should have been number 12? Should have been number 1? I don't know. It'd be lovely to continue the conversation below. Anyway, that's it from me. I hope you're keeping well, and I guess all that remains for me to say is see you soon. Peace.